Welcome back. You know, we've gotten several emails asking whether baby boomers should go for a yearly mammogram. I know for many women it can be nerve-wracking. And now former ABC morning talk show host Joan London recently announced that she has breast cancer. So all of this has brought it back into the spotlight, particularly the subject of mammograms. I want to go back to our colleague Nick Tate in our South Florida studios to talk about mammography and what's new and what's the latest. Nick, first, let's answer that question. Should women of baby boomer age always be getting a mammogram?
You know, it really depends on the woman's risk. It really depends on her age. There has been a great deal of controversy over whether women under the age of 50 in particular benefit from a regular mammogram. So there's a great deal of controversy. The problem is that conventional mammograms and digital mammograms are two-dimensional images, and they don't reveal as much about the breast tissue as they could. And it really depends on the skill of the radiologist reading those scans to determine whether a suspicious mass, a lump, something that looks like it might be cancer actually is. The problem is that with the 2D mammograms, a lot of women are referred for painful biopsies and follow-up procedures, even when those particular masses would never be harmful, they would never lead to cancer. So one of the new things that's happening is researchers are combining digital mammograms with a 3D technology that makes those images clearer, makes them easier to read, and at least theoretically at this point can give radiologists a better view of that breast tissue.
What can you tell us about the 3D mammography, particularly for the woman? Is it more difficult for her to endure? Because that sometimes is something that holds women back from seeking out a mammography.
Right. It's really not. The machines are virtually the same as traditional mammography screening, but this new technique, which is called tomosynthesis, provides a better image. You know, it's sort of a simplistic comparison, but if you think about the images that we used to see in the Disney films of the 50s and the 60s, you know, Sleeping Beauty and Bambi, and compare them to Avatar or some of the 3D films, you can really see the differences and the amount of information that's provided. And so what it would provide doctors and radiologists is a better view of the breast. For women, there are some downsides, though. These new 3D mammograms do have more radiation. It's about twice as much radiation as a traditional mammogram, and they cost more. They're about $100 more than a traditional mammogram. So those considerations really need to be weighed.
Thanks, Nick. We certainly appreciate that information. To give us even further insight, joining us now is our Newsmax contributor, Dr. Peter Hibbert. He's also in our South Florida studios. Peter, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Nick just mentioned that there might be some downsides to 3D mammography. What might they include, in your opinion?
Well, when we look at mammography, we're using X-ray ionizing radiation. And so the dosing for a 3D mammogram is higher than a conventional mammogram.
So what would that mean to the patient?
Well, I think you're exposing the breast to a higher rad. We know, and we've advised people under the age of 50, unless they have high risk factors, to look at screening procedures in the form of mammography only once they've reached age 50, unless something is overwhelmingly in favor of exposing the breast earlier. I think the big deal for me is that we need to select people who are going to have to get higher doses, and for what reason? We're using a screening. This is a screening test. Remember, a mammogram does not pick up all cancers, even when there's a cancer there. A mammogram can be read as normal, and even a 3D mammogram may indeed be the same way. I mean, we have young people with dense breasts in their late 20s, early 30s that will have normal mammograms, and they have invasive carcinoma.
We've been hearing that terminology, dense breast, recently. What does that mean exactly if a woman has been told that her breasts are dense?
I think what we're talking about is glandular tissue. If the breast itself is dense, has dense glands, not a lot of fat in it, the contrast is a little more difficult for the radiologist to see. Mammograms are not just like pictures. They're rather hard to interpret. Even most surgeons and general docs, ER docs, we don't look at mammograms the way a radiologist does. You really have to be a specialist in reading these because they are so difficult to read the way they are. Now, the 3D mammograms are going to make it a good deal easier to interpret the depth and the nature of these things, but I think the same problems are still going to be laying there, and that is there's some people that simply will not have their cancer picked up on mammography, and they need to be either an ultrasound or an MRI needs to be considered when someone's thinking there might be a malignancy issue going on.
Let's talk about the ultrasound, because that's how Joan London said she found her cancer, not through the traditional mammogram, but in the follow-up ultrasound. Would you suggest that become regular procedure for most women?
Look, I think if you've got a family history of breast malignancy, you've got to do whatever you need to do to screen yourself sensibly. And to wait until age 50 is silly when you've got a positive family history. An ultrasound augments the information you get. Remember, breast self-examination is the beginning of drawing attention to something that seems wrong. And if you use technology to try to find out what it is before you biopsy, it makes good sense. An ultrasound will help define whether there's a cyst or it's solid. And I think the thought of just relying on a mammogram to pick up problems in breast tissue is probably not the best way to look at a mammogram.
Are insurance companies on board with the ultrasounds and the 3Ds, or are they putting up roadblocks and saying, wait a minute, you can get it, but we're not necessarily going to pay for it?
I think probably the ultrasounds are probably being granted pretty easily. The mammograms are being granted pretty easily. It's the MRIs that they're balking at.
What would you suggest for women who have been told they have dense breasts, who do the breast exams on a regular basis? Would you suggest that they ask their doctors about ultrasounds and or 3D?
I don't think I'd push the 3D at the moment. I don't think there's enough information to justify, again, exposing young breasts to radiation early. We have baseline mammograms we advise women in their 30s to used to, and at this point, there's even some debate whether the baselines are needed. The ultrasound's nice in that it doesn't expose the breast to any risk of increasing malignancy. And if you mammogram and mammogram and mammogram and mammogram, the British studies were the first that came out and said, hey, these mammograms may be causing some breast cancers. So that's why the dosing and the ages were adjusted somewhat, because there is a risk.
All right. Dr. Peter Hibbard, thank you very much for your insight on breast cancer. As always, we suggest our viewers talk with their individual doctors before making any kind of decisions, but we're trying to give you as much information as possible so that you can make the right decision for you. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, it's your questions that we'll be answering. Our doctors are staying in the studio, and they're going to answer all the questions that you have. We'll be right back.